sat atop the mountain, overlooking the valleys and the forests and jungles below, the story of the strange, wandering, lonely creatures looks different from there, and it makes perfect sense why we say higher self and higher perspective, at least from a linguistic point of view. With and in and through higher self, you see so much, understand more of the picture, and not only with the mind, but with intuition. And this is the subject of today's episode. So let's get right into this. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Anton Jarrett, and you are listening to the Higher Self Dialogues. The topics I'm going to touch upon in this episode could demand longer treatments, but I'm going to keep this episode short by comparison. What I'm introducing today could very well be a whole sub-series in itself, which I might say would focus on what I call critical spirituality. This is still emerging for me as a form and expression of spirituality. I'm still figuring out how to express and manifest it, and indeed this might still not go anywhere, but I'm in the process of trying to figure out how I might engage with the many issues that are going on around us that are so pressing, so present in a way, and to do this in a way, and this is the key thing, that is authentic from my experience and being. Because in some ways, a problem emerges, at least for me, that could basically be expressed like this. With the higher perspective, I can see how everything connects, and I can see the bigger picture. And in this way, from there, there's nothing to criticize. Everything is as it should, could, and must be. So how can any critical engagement with life emerge out of that? If everything is perfectly as it should be, warts and all, what is left to say? Also, how can I possibly take a side on this or that issue in a world that demands you take a side when you see that all sides are one and all sides are as one? I'm going to unpack and explore this a little. The higher self journey, at least as I've experienced it, has been one of integrating polarities and opposites and multiplicities, less as a purely mental or intellectual exercise, though included in this integration is the mental ability to synthesize different perspectives and arguments and points, but more as a holistic form of being that includes emotions, intellect, and intuition, in which the underlying nature of reality emerges and is understood, in which past, present, and future are connected as one non-linear whole, in which the invisible hand of a divine source of being is seen and felt and intuited as present in all the seemingly disconnected, chaotic elements of life, and where this is far from being a mental perception alone, but a lived experience for which words truly cannot be found. In the face of daily conflicts, battles, issues, warring discourses that play out in the media, in conversation, in our culture, it can seem quite difficult to engage with what is going on. But again, the difficulty here is only apparent, and it mainly comes about through what I think is the lack of manifesting the integration that is in the present moment of difficulty. It's a form of a spiritual bypassing can occur where where there's a failure to connect the non-dual with the dual, where perhaps there's just too strong a form of resting in the non-duality. But the step into the higher perspective and form of being doesn't erase the existence of the dualistic, limited personal form of being, just as the limited form of individualized, separated self doesn't erase the higher. I mean, the lower self is still there, with all its training and socialization and education and experience of separation, all still intact, still in the memory. It's not forgotten. It's the integrated self that can then access the dualistic as well as the non-dualistic perspective and way of being simultaneously, and that can therefore speak with both tongues, speak both languages, which of course to the self is just one language. So bringing all these things together, I thought I would unpack and speak about, and two, by way of introduction to a more critical form of spirituality, by way of critique in the more philosophical sense of the word, a few contemporary issues or topics of conversation that I'm sure you're familiar with already, namely the rise of the manosphere and femosphere, and the current conflicts in Ukraine, Israel. What speaks from the self that is both in the forest and on the mountain? A little caveat and disclosure first. I'm not claiming here to be an expert on any of these subjects, and I'm not someone who has done extensive research on any of these subjects either. I'm coming at these topics as just a member of the public going about daily life and just hearing what I'm hearing. I perfectly understand that there is much more nuance and detail to all of these areas, and especially if you are a more well-informed supporter or detractor, it may feel like I'm misrepresenting things, but my aim here is actually not to give fuel for either support or detraction, but to simply respond with the higher perspective and being that I can bring from where I am today. With all that said, let me turn my attention first to the manosphere and femosphere. I first became aware of the manosphere and femosphere probably like many who don't fully identify as being signed up members of these online spaces, just through mainstream news and internet browsing, and then just through my own internet research and reading of different journals, just to get a bit, better informed about what it was all about, as well as, of course, need to do that, watch a few things from various prominent members of the manosphere and femosphere. I recognize that this doesn't qualify me as being well informed, and I'm not claiming to be either. But what strikes me about these spaces and the worldviews and philosophies that they seem to be predicated on is that in many ways they are expressing, manifesting and mirroring some of the early underlying dynamics that go on in the integration of higher and lower self. In that early development where higher self really is experienced as other, there is at first a confronting with the hidden unpleasant aspects of self that have been deemed by the conscious lower self as disgusting in some way. And this is most prominent in the area of one's own sexuality. As higher self begins to speak, the unconscious aspects of sexuality begin to stir, and this is the feminine sexuality in the male and the masculine sexuality in the female. For many, the entry of this in all its various forms in the consciousness is abhorrent. It's scary, and it causes a great deal of insecurity. The feminine for the man, just as the masculine for the woman, becomes something to fear, to fight, to overcome. For me, the expressions of misogyny and misandry are fear projections of not yet integrated, still polarized sexuality within. And I guess there's nothing new in that perspective in a way. It can refer to all kinds of psychological traditions and teachings about that. There's nothing particularly, mystical or spiritual about that. From the higher perspective, I can say that what I see in the rise of these online spaces is a symptom of growth and growing pains. The manifestations of it are unpleasant, and the conflict they create, in some cases, violence and aggression and truly dark spaces they create are deeply disturbing, but they are understandable given the near total ignorance that the world has about psychospiritual development and higher consciousness. Not that understanding these things would make it more pleasant or less symptomatic, I wouldn't say that, but society would have more tools and antidotes to deal with what could become a major source of social dysfunction. The growing pains show me that the spiritual body is growing, and from a place of deeper love and compassion, there is a call in this to those who can provide relief to provide it, because there's suffering going on here. And what we see is inner separation in action, and the pain of it is on display for all to see. Well, you can probably see by that. I mean, there's so much there. There's, this really is just an introduction to this idea. I could definitely say much more about this. There's so much that could be said about it. Probably a whole series of discussions, perhaps even a whole podcast series could be dedicated to this. But I'll move on. I'll leave that one there. And I'll just now turn to this idea. I made some notes about the conflict in Ukraine and Israel, especially in the case of what is happening in Israel, particularly. These conflicts seem to demand that you pick a side, and in the eyes of some, you cannot but do so. It's not enough to see both sides, to see that no side or party of influence has the upper moral hand. You have to make a distinction in ordinary life between who is right and who is wrong, who is innocent, who is guilty. And for many people, understandably so, there is clarity there, and to not endorse or accept that clarity puts you on a side, makes you either a fellow or a foe. As I said earlier, the integrated, dual and non-dual perspective allows for the limited, situated physical self's perspective to be intact. The moral position that arises from, living your life, being in a certain place and time with a certain family history, skin color, sexuality, education, they all remain intact. They're not erased. But neither are they then the whole story. They're just the tip of the iceberg. Whilst my temporal self may, like many people, totally abhor that fact of war that means that many who have no direct part in causing conflict, like little children, are killed by terrible weapons or live in conditions of hell and are what we understand to be innocent victims of unresolved world pain and drama, I cannot also be blind to the deeper energetic patterns that connect us all, which make us all, through time, take on roles as aggressor or aggressed, victim and torturer. In the evolution of self, we have all had to take on the role of killer and killed in order to participate in the grand unfolding of evolution, to be both the sufferer and the bearer of suffering. Thankfully, we can only become aware of this deeply when we're able to bear the weight of this realization. But what emerges then is not a bypassing of suffering, a blind appeal to karma and a shrugging of shoulders, although this may be the case for some, sadly, but a great and deep compassion, for we have all been there under the bombs. Maybe not precisely in this life, like some, but in another for sure, and perhaps in time to come. The higher perspective of context for the necessity, inevitability of war at times and its connection to everything else is just as clear and insistent and painful as the one that feels horror at what people are perpetrating. And holding both simultaneously and all that comes with it is a difficult space to be in. From that space, much more can and will be said for sure. That, I think I'll leave it there, brings me to the end of this episode. As I said, there is, I think, a critical spirituality, a critique that spirituality can provide, and that's an important and often neglected aspect of spirituality, especially modern spirituality. I've been thinking about it a long time, but there's still quite a few things I need to think through more, many issues and questions that I'm trying to resolve. So I'm just sounding things out here. Watch this space, and yes, please share with me any of your own thoughts about critical spirituality. Perhaps you've also explored this and encountered and worked through the many issues that come up when you critically engage with issues of the day from a spiritual perspective. Thank you for listening to the Higher Self Dialogues. Until the next time, goodbye.